Welcome to Middleweight Politics, political analysis for the independent voter. I am one half of your co-hosting duo, Dan Sally.
I'm Shawn Griffiths.
And if you are one of the majority of Americans who is tired of voting for the lesser of two evils, and if you are one of the majority of Americans who feels we need more than two choices on the ballot, we believe two choices are too few, and we talk about the problems that it causes and the reforms that can fix them. Now, in Trump's first term, he made us wait a whole 4 years for a constitutional crisis, and this time around, he came into D.C. prepared to throw us into one in his second week as president. Last week, the Office of Management and Budget, under guidance from the Trump administration, froze funding on federal grants and loans, sparking confusion in pretty much every branch of government before rescinding it 45 hours later, which was equally confusing. Now, the freeze appears to be another work of political brinksmanship aimed at curbing government spending, a core tenet of the Republican platform for some time. So in this episode, we are going to break down the politics of government spending, the role both major parties have played in adding to our national debt, and why they have such a tough time fixing the problem. But first, so Shawn, we are recording this earlier than usual. It's Thursday, January 30th, week 2 of 208 in Trump's second term. Not that I'm counting.
Yeah.
And I think it'd be tough for us to start this without talking about the crash that happened in Washington, D.C.,
right,
where an American Airlines jet and a military chopper crashed. As far as we know, no one has survived. So very, very sad situation.
I've been following the news on this a bit, and someone had posted in my Blue Sky timeline a series of events that have happened in the last 2 weeks leading up to this crash, including on January 20th, the immediate firing of the FAA director. And then the next day or next couple of days, you have the aviation safety committee that was disbanded by the Trump administration, followed by the notice to federal employees that they could retire or leave. And I think what this is going to end up doing is leading to confusion, because right now we don't know exactly what happened. At the end of the day, not even Trump knows the full story of what happened, what caused this. The fact that he's coming out and blaming some DEI policies from previous administrations is a little wild.
The man cannot help himself. It's like him and DEI. It's like 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon. Everything goes back to DEI. Do you remember the Baltimore bridge crash?
Yeah.
Where that ship crashed? Yeah, that was blamed on DEI.
And it's like the term woke. At this point, DEI and woke, those two terms, are meaningless when I hear it, especially when they come from MAGA or from conservatives, because what does it mean in their context versus what it actually means? And usually when they use it, it's not in the context of what it actually should or does mean.
Now, the interesting thing is that DEI was part of the pretense for this memo that went out freezing government spending. And so in it, the memo talks about using federal resources to advance Marxist equity, transgenderism, and Green New Deal social engineering policies. That's the pretense. Now, the bigger picture here, of course, is this is giving red meat both to cultural conservatives, but it's also addressing a longstanding concern of the Republican Party over federal spending. So I've spent the last couple of days doing nothing but research into federal spending, the debt, tax policy. I feel like I just ate 8 buttons of peyote with everything I've learned, and I'm going to try to boil it down as much as possible. And so there's some financial history in here, Shawn. There's some political history, and then there's the legal framework that the government uses to allocate money, or the government should use to allocate money. And Shawn, your job, as I kind of Sherpa us through this, is to make sure I'm not being totally boring. So we'll start off with the financial history, right? There's always a lot of conversation. Who is the party of fiscal discipline? And the Republicans have kind of taken on that moniker. Now, one thing that's been said ad nauseum is that no party can claim to be the party of fiscal responsibility. Because if you look, since the 1970s, the US government has continuously engaged in deficit spending and added to the debt under Republican and Democratic presidents and Republican and Democratic Congresses. The only time the government ever balanced the budget was this magical period, you might remember, Shawn, in the late 90s, where Bill Clinton cooperated with a Republican Congress to actually create a budget surplus. It's the only time in history. And at that time, I thought the magic formula was a Democratic president and a Republican Congress. And then the next 25 years happened, and that totally smashed that dream. But so this has been a bipartisan issue, the issue of deficit spending and the issue of adding to the debt.
What's funny about that deal that Clinton made with Republicans in Congress is that it followed not too long after Bush made a deal with Congress, a budget deal that increased taxes after in 1988, he said on the campaign trail, read my lips, no new taxes. They're not really being a party of fiscal responsibility now. I know there's a lot of Republicans who get in Congress who on the campaign trail say, we're going to get in there, we're going to cut spending, we're going to lower taxes. But then they get into office and they realize that's not that simple. It's never that easy.
No. Well, so here's the thing. Voters don't want higher taxes, right? And voters don't want less stuff from government. So fiscal discipline is an electoral loser.
Yeah.
And the funny thing about it is the Republicans weren't always the party of fiscal discipline. This was really something that happened around the 1980s. And so the origins of this go back to an economist in the 1970s, Jude Wanniski. And he came up with what was called the two Santa Claus theory. And the idea went that the Democrats, for the past 30 years, since the New Deal, had been the party of government spending. They had been the party whose gifts to voters had been lavish government programs, right? And the Democrats had also dominated politics for the decades that followed. Now, the idea was that the Republicans can't be the Santa Clauses of spending, but they can be the Santa Clauses of tax cuts. So prior to this theory, the Republicans were kind of the bad guys. They were the people who wanted to take money away from voters. But the idea was, let's give them tax cuts. And then with that, the Democrats would be forced to cut budgets and fiscal discipline would be restored. Now, the idea was that the Republican Santa would beat the Democratic Santa. The problem is both Santas survived, and now here we are.
Yeah, it's paradoxical to suggest that you could cut taxes but do nothing about spending. But at the same time, what you do with spending will affect Americans on the whole. And so when lawmakers get into Congress and they say, hey, we're gonna go in there, we're gonna gut, the spending and restore fiscal responsibility. Well, who are you taking money from? And at that point, that's when you get a lot of lobbied interests who are going to have a say in, we want to cut Social Security, Medicaid. Well, here comes the AARP to talk about that, right?
And you bring up a really interesting point about the role special interests play in our fiscal policy, because there is a legal framework for passing a federal budget that involves a fair degree of oversight. And the process is complex and it's boring, Shawn, but I'm going to boil it down so everybody can understand what's going on without falling asleep. So what happens in the legal framework for passing a federal budget is committees meet and they discuss appropriations to various agencies. And during those conversations, they scrutinize the spending and decide how they could spend it differently and how much money they should get. And that's a good thing, right? Now, that process has also been followed a total of 4 times since it was put into law in 1974. And normally, what Congress does is they allocate spending via omnibus spending bills, which are these Bible-sized pieces of legislation with all sorts of pork just crammed in there. Nobody has time to read it. And it's kind of a poison pill, because what they'll do is they'll include funding for like veterans health care, which nobody can disagree with. And then they'll include a whole bunch of crap on top of that, but nobody can vote against the omnibus spending bill because they're going to be accused of voting against veterans' health care. And this has happened successively year over year. And so what happens is there's not that oversight into how agencies spend money. And as a result, opportunities to improve efficiency, improve services, maybe even cut the budget a little bit are entirely ignored.
Right. We fail to have a nuanced conversation because of omnibus bills and continuous resolutions. Meanwhile, no one knows what's in these bills, and that is frustrating to Americans. They're not getting all the information they need, but they understand that lawmakers are also passing these bills without reading them, which frustrates them even more.
And I think the problem is that we only have so much time where we can play this game. So right now, debt service payments, that's our monthly minimum. That's just what we pay to carry the debt, is larger than our military spending. So we spend more on net interest on the debt than military spending. This is also a period where interest rates are at historic norms. So I know everybody thinks interest rates are high. 5-6% is the historic norm. The 0% rates we were used to are an aberration, first and foremost. Okay. Now, the second part of that is that up until recently, the markets had a never ending appetite for US government debt. The only time the US credit rating was ever reduced was back in, I think it was 2011 or 2012, and they couldn't agree on taking on more debt. So the market said, we're more concerned with you not taking on more debt than they were with, we're concerned with you taking on debt. Now that's changed. And you do hear leaders in the financial industry starting to express concerns about government spending and debt. I know Jamie Dimon of JP Morgan is one of them. Ray Dalio, former hedge fund manager, another one. And so it's clear that this is an issue that we need to address, but there's also not really any political incentive to do so. Now, add to that the level of political polarization. Forget like getting committees to sit together and actually hash out finances. I mean, there aren't nearly enough hot takes for social media in those hearings, right? But they can't even agree on these continuing resolutions to fund the government. That's a direct result of political polarization. And the danger in many ways is more our inability to tackle our nation's finances, the inability of Congress to do the job it's supposed to do, than it is the dollar amount.
Again, I think there is an area where most Americans, if you ask them, do you think the government should cut wasteful spending? They're going to say yes. I think a lot of Americans will also say, though, that the government should take care of essential programs and benefits to the people who need those programs. That is the common ground that a lot of Americans can agree on that we don't see from our politicians because, like you said, the incentive isn't there for them to bridge partisan gaps. And hyperpolarization is so extreme right now. You can't even get Republicans to agree on some things, much less you can't get Republicans and Democrats to come together on these issues and find solutions in a system that is incentivized at every level for them to put their own self-interest before putting solutions first.
And I don't know if you heard this, but Chip Roy, a prominent member of the GOP's Freedom Caucus, actually skipped out on a Republican retreat at Mar-a-Lago. Mm-hmm. And his stated reason was, I can't justify spending $2,000 to listen to my party make excuses for deficit spending. So the party of fiscal discipline is fracturing over this.
And this type of polarization we are seeing from members of the House like Chip Roy, who at the same time do want their party to do something about their promises to adhere to fiscal responsibility, but at the same time are telling Speaker Mike Johnson, hey, we are going to threaten your seat or we are going to make things difficult for you if you work with the other side, which is inevitably what happened was that Mike Johnson made some deals with some Democrats in order to get this continuous resolution to pass and keep the government funded. And then you had Republicans in his ear saying, don't do this, just wait 2 weeks and we don't have to work with Democrats. And that's a problem. That is the crux of the issue here.
Yeah, the battle of the Santas continues. So, in preparation for this episode, I uploaded a bunch of financial data into ChatGPT and a bunch of historical data. And I had a conversation with it, which is great. Like, this is what I do at 4 a.m. I talk to ChatGPT. It's like a conversation with myself, laughs at my jokes. It's great. But what came out of that conversation was an absolute fiscal acid trip, Shawn. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that because you've talked a little bit about the current state of affairs. We've talked a little bit about when the Republicans became the party of fiscal discipline. But there's something that happened right after that that really changed the nature of government finances. Because we talk a lot about government debt as a percentage of GDP and how that keeps going up, right? But we don't always talk about why that is. And so I looked at a couple things. So the first thing I looked at is, what are tax receipts as a percentage of GDP? Because that would tell us, okay, is it tax cuts, for example? So did Reagan's tax cuts in the 80s or Bush's tax cuts or Trump's tax cuts add to the deficit more? And, it's inconclusive. It kind of hovers at the same rate, like around 15, 16%. So those are dollars the government is taking in as a percentage of GDP. Now, the next thing I looked at, government spending as a percentage of GDP. Now, that edges up slightly, right? Not by leaps and bounds, but edges up just a percentage point or two, every few years. And so not a huge increase. But again, year over year, that starts to add up to the debt. So we get a little bit closer. Okay, we start to understand, okay, this is partly what's doing it. But there's another factor to throw in here, and that's what's driving the spending, and has tax policy changed over the last 50 years, and if so, how? And this is where things get really interesting. And so we'll start with tax policy. So in the 1980s, Reagan did a lot of things to streamline tax policy, and there were some good things that happened out of that. So he lowered the top marginal tax rate. He closed a lot of loopholes. All that is good. One of the other things he did is he lowered the capital gains tax. So the taxes you paid on income were lower, but also the taxes you paid on investments. And he lowered that from 28% to 20%. Now, the second part is, what's driving deficit spending? Well, if you talk to a lot of economists, the number one driver behind the increase in federal spending and the continued increase in deficit spending going into the coming years is an increase in the cost of both Social Security and Medicare, two programs geared towards seniors. Mm-hmm. Okay. Now, if we put those two together, seniors, for the most part, are more likely to have a large amount of investable assets that are going to be taxed at the capital gains rate of 20%, correct? They are also the recipients of benefits from both Social Security and Medicare. So what we have is we have a tax structure where those who are the greatest recipients of federal funds are also paying the lowest in terms of taxes. And I'm going to keep saying this while my diabetic cat keeps whining. You might be able to hear him in the background. But it creates a skewed structure here where wage earners effectively are taxed at a higher tax rate. They are contributing more to the federal budget. The seniors who are drawing more from entitlement programs are contributing less, again, because they're paying less on capital gains tax. They're not paying that as income. And the wage earners are getting left with the bill. Now, that isn't to say that entitlement programs are bad. That isn't to say seniors shouldn't receive them. But what it does point out is a flaw in the system where wage earners are getting taxed more on their labor than the investor class is on their assets. So I'm not an economist. I'm not a tax expert. But one thing I would say is that we should have a system that rewards work.
Yeah.
And we're not creating incentives for that right now.
And it creates quite the conundrum when you're running for office and you want to be a part of a party that touts fiscal responsibility. And yet you are in a system where you solely rely mostly on partisan primary voters to get elected. And these voters are going to be the most partisan voters, but they're also going to be older voters. The most reliable voting bloc are voters 65 plus.
Mm-hmm.
And so when you have this situation where, yes, these people are drawing out from Social Security, they're drawing out from Medicare, but they're also benefiting from a lower capital gains tax, that creates a kind of a weird conundrum for you.
Yeah. Well, and there's a chicken or egg question here,
Right.
which is policy the way it is because older voters are turning out in greater numbers, or are older voters turning out in greater numbers because policy is what it is? And I think it might be a mix of both. But here's the interesting thing. So getting back to debt to GDP, there are 2 times when we have managed to correct the financial course of this country. One was after World War II, when we had a debt equally as high as the one we have now in terms of a percentage of GDP. Okay. The second was that magical period in the late 90s where we had a budget surplus, right? And the same thing happened both times. In the case of World War II or the post-war period, the US economy grew at such a rapid clip that they didn't have to pay down the debt in terms of total dollars. The economy just grew to the point where the debt to GDP ratio went down. And certainly there was some budget cutting. We weren't spending on the war effort, for example, but primarily it was the result of the economy growing. Same thing happened in the late 90s. So we had the fall of the Iron Curtain, which reduced military spending, and we had the internet boom, which increased tax receipts. We had 2 scenarios where the economy outgrew the debt. Now, the interesting thing, especially when we talk about the internet boom, is the internet boom was a result of technological innovation, which was the result of government investment in DARPA, right? So the entire internet is built on a military program. And so when we look at where our spending priorities are now, we really have to ask ourselves, not how much are we spending, but are we spending it on things that are going to pay us back? And I would argue when you look at Medicare and Social Security, we are spending on consumption. Those are dollars we are not getting back into the system. And I'm not saying don't spend money on that, but also spend money on initiatives that are going to grow the size of the economy. So, for example, I think government investment in AI is going to have a huge payoff for us. But we can't have AI policy written by a group of people who don't understand how Facebook works. So we have given the listener one of those gigantic 6-foot submarine sandwiches, and we've asked them to eat it in a little over a half hour. Okay. So we've given you, dear listener, a lot. So to just summarize what we've said, there's no party that's out there that's looking to do anything about the deficit because there's no political incentive to do so, right? Nobody wants to raise taxes. Nobody wants to cut off the faucet to all those government goodies. And they certainly don't want to sit down and have to compromise and reach an agreement to fix anything. But part 2 is the way out may not be an issue of cutting spending or raising taxes, even though that might help. The issue might be making sure that where we invest our money is in growth areas. And the only way to do that is to get a greater diversity of voices in there. And that requires some serious changes to the way we elect people to office. Shawn, did I hit all the notes? Did I miss anything?
I think you hit them all. I think we're good.
Well, let's just end it right there then. Thank you very much for listening to this episode. If you liked what you heard today, please write a review, rate this episode, and share this with people you think need to hear it. There are more of us than there are of them out there, and if we gather in the right numbers, we can make real change. Theme music is courtesy of the U.S. Coast Guard Band. Thank you again for listening to Middleweight Politics, and stay purple.